The third man effect, seeing people who aren't there. You're going to die alone. That's the thought running through your head as your body shuts down, as the cold seeps into your bones, as every logical part of your brain screams that this is the end. And then someone appears, not physically but undeniably there, a presence beside you, a voice in your ear, a companion who shouldn't exist but feels more real than the ground beneath your feet. Here's what nobody tells you about the human mind. It will lie to you to keep you alive. It will manufacture entire people, complete with personalities and advice, rather than let you face death in isolation. This isn't some mystical mumbo-jumbo or religious miracle. This is psychology and human behavior at its most desperate and brilliant. The third man effect has saved lives for centuries, guiding explorers through blizzards, sailors through storms, and survivors through impossible situations. But here's the uncomfortable truth that science is only now beginning to unpack. These aren't just random hallucinations your oxygen-starved brain conjures up. They're sophisticated psychological constructions that reveal something deeply unsettling about the nature of consciousness, reality, and what your mind is capable of when survival is on the line. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like this force us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. How much of what you perceive as real is actually just your brain's best guess? And if your mind can create entire people when you need them most, what else is it creating that you accept as undeniably true? Most people think hallucinations are a sign of mental illness, a breakdown of normal brain function that needs to be medicated away. But what if I told you that the ability to hallucinate a helpful companion is actually one of the most advanced survival mechanisms evolution ever produced? What if the people who can't generate these presences are the ones at a disadvantage when facing extreme isolation and mortal danger? The research coming out of neuroscience labs is flipping our understanding of weird psychology on its head. Institutions like the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and University of California have discovered that the third man effect isn't a malfunction, it's a feature. Your brain has specialized circuits designed to manufacture social support when none exists externally, because humans are so fundamentally social that complete isolation is literally life-threatening. We're not talking about feeling lonely, we're talking about measurable physiological deterioration that happens when your brain can't engage in social processing. Your stress hormones spike, your immune system weakens, your decision-making becomes impaired, and your will to survive starts crumbling. The third man effect is your brain's emergency override, a last-ditch effort to provide the social scaffolding. You need to keep fighting. And here's the really wild part. It works. People who experience these presences have demonstrably higher survival rates than those who don't, even when controlling for other factors like experience, equipment, and physical condition. Now here's where it gets dark and where most feel-good stories about guardian angels conveniently stop talking. Not every presence that shows up is there to help you. Some survivors report companions that criticized them, tormented them, or actively tried to sabotage their survival. The same neural machinery that creates a benevolent guide can just as easily create a malevolent persecutor, and the difference comes down to factors we're only beginning to understand. Guilt, trauma, neurochemical imbalances, the specific nature of the stress you're under. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena don't come with an instruction manual, and your brain doesn't always get it right when it's operating on fumes. There are documented cases of people who followed the advice of their third man and walked in circles until they died of exposure. There are climbers who report hostile presences that told them to jump off cliffs. There are sailors who developed such intense relationships with their invisible companions that returning to human society felt like abandonment and betrayal. This isn't just academic curiosity. This is about understanding one of the most powerful and least discussed aspects of human behavior under extreme stress. Because if your mind can create people who feel absolutely real, who can you trust when you're pushed to your absolute limit? How do you know if the voice in your head is your salvation or your destruction? The solution isn't to dismiss these experiences as mere hallucinations or to romanticize them as mystical encounters. The solution is to understand the neuroscience, to map the psychological terrain, and to recognize that your brain is both more powerful and more fragile than you ever imagined. What you're about to learn in this deep dive will fundamentally change how you think about consciousness, reality, and the thin line between survival instinct and psychological breakdown. We're going to explore the documented cases, from Shackleton's Antarctic expedition to 9/11 survivors to solo ocean crossings, and examine what modern neuroscience reveals about the temporoparietal junction, the role of extreme stress on perception, and why some people's third man stays helpful while others turn hostile. You'll discover the specific conditions that trigger these presences, the brain regions involved in constructing them, and most importantly, what happens when the companion doesn't leave after the crisis ends. This isn't just about weird psychology for its own sake. This is about understanding a fundamental aspect of human behavior that could save your life or someone you love when everything else has failed. Because the truth is, we're all one catastrophic situation away from meeting our own third man, and whether that presence becomes your greatest ally or your worst nightmare might depend on knowledge you gain right here, right now. The presence that appears in the void. There's something profoundly unsettling about being alone in a place where survival isn't guaranteed, and yet, somehow, you're not alone. Mountaineers, shipwreck survivors, and polar explorers have described it. For centuries, a presence beside them, guiding them, whispering encouragement when their bodies were ready to give up. It's not a ghost story or some religious miracle. It's your brain doing what it does best when you're pushed to the absolute edge. This phenomenon, tucked away in the corners of psychology and human behavior, reveals one of the strangest and most unusual psychological phenomena you'll ever encounter. The third man effect doesn't care if you're a believer or a skeptic. It shows up when your mind decides you need company, whether that company exists or not. Ernest Shackleton, the legendary Antarctic explorer, was one of the first to report it during his 1916 expedition. He swore there was an extra person walking with his team across the frozen wasteland, someone who wasn't actually there, but felt as real as the ice beneath their feet. And here's the kicker. He wasn't hallucinating from frostbite or dehydration. He was experiencing something far more complex. Something that sits right at the intersection of neuroscience and survival instinct. The void doesn't just mean physical emptiness. It means the psychological space where your brain realizes it's running out of options and needs to manufacture hope. Now let's get one thing straight. This isn't about going crazy or losing your grip on reality in some dramatic Hollywood fashion. The third man effect is your brain's emergency protocol, a failsafe that kicks in when stress hormones flood your system and rational thinking starts to crumble. Think about it. When you're exhausted, dehydrated, oxygen deprived, or facing imminent death, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and decision-making, starts to shut down. Meanwhile, other regions, like the temporal and parietal lobes, go into overdrive, trying to make sense of sensory information that's all scrambled up. That's when weird psychology takes center stage. Your brain, in its desperate attempt to keep you moving forward, creates a companion. Not because you're weak, but because isolation combined with extreme stress is one of the most dangerous psychological states a human can experience. Studies from institutions like the University of California and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology have shown that when the brain's spatial awareness gets disrupted, particularly the temporoparietal junction, people start sensing presences that aren't physically there. It's like your mind is saying, "Oh, look, we're in trouble here, so I'm going to give you someone to talk to, someone to follow, because that's better than giving up." Here's where it gets really interesting. The presence isn't always friendly. Most accounts describe a benevolent figure, someone offering guidance or comfort, but some survivors report something darker, a critical voice, an entity that feels threatening rather than supportive. Ron DeFrancesco, one of the last people to escape the South Tower on 9/11, described hearing a voice urging him to keep climbing when he was ready to collapse from smoke inhalation. That voice, he said, probably saved his life. But contrast that with solo sailors who've reported malevolent presences during prolonged isolation at sea, shadows that felt accusatory, judgmental, even hostile. The difference might come down to the nature of the stressor and the person's mental state going in. If you're fighting to survive with a clear purpose, like Shackleton trying to save his men, your brain manufactures a helpful guide. But if you're trapped in ambiguity, guilt, or moral conflict, that manufactured presence can turn into something that reflects your inner turmoil. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like this don't follow neat rules. They're shaped by your history, your fears, and the specific cocktail of neurotransmitters flooding your system at that moment. The void becomes a mirror, and what you see in it depends on what you bring to the edge of that precipice. What makes the third man effect so compelling isn't just that it happens, it's that it works. People who experience this phenomenon often credit their invisible companion with saving their lives, giving them the push they needed to take one more step, climb one more meter, swim one more stroke. Peter Hillary, son of Edmund Hillary, reported feeling a presence during a near-fatal storm on Everest, describing how this unseen figure seemed to offer both comfort and direction when visibility dropped to zero. The hiker Aaron Ralston, who cut off his own arm to escape a boulder in Utah, didn't report a third man per se, but he described a dissociative state where he felt guided by something outside himself, a similar neurological response to extreme stress. These aren't outliers, they're documented cases showing that when human behavior is pushed to its absolute limit, the mind creates psychological scaffolding to keep the body functioning, and that scaffolding, as strange as it sounds, often takes the form of another person, someone who isn't there but feels more real than anything else in that moment. The void doesn't stay empty for long when survival demands otherwise. The desperate imaginary companion. Let's talk about what happens when the brain doesn't just sense a presence, it builds an entire relationship with it. The desperate imaginary companion isn't some fleeting shadow or vague feeling of being watched. It's a fully formed entity that talks back, offers advice, and sometimes even argues with you. This is where psychology and human behavior take a sharp turn into territory that most people find deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. Because once you start having conversations with someone who doesn't exist, society tends to slap a label on you, and not a flattering one. But here's what the research actually shows. Creating an imaginary companion under extreme duress isn't a sign of mental illness. It's a sophisticated coping mechanism that your brain deploys when isolation threatens to break you completely. Solo sailors on months-long voyages have reported developing elaborate relationships with these manufactured personalities, giving them names, distinct voices, even physical characteristics. Joshua Slocum, who completed the first solo circumnavigation of the globe in 1898, wrote about a spectral pilot who appeared during a storm and helped him navigate through the night. He described this figure in remarkable detail, down to the historical period costume he wore. That's not weird psychology gone wrong. That's weird psychology doing exactly what it's designed to do when a human being faces the psychological torture of complete isolation combined with mortal danger. The distinction between the third man effect and a full-blown imaginary companion comes down to duration and complexity. The third man, usually, appears briefly during acute crisis, a few hours, maybe a day or two at most, but the desperate imaginary companion sticks around, becoming a fixture of daily existence when the crisis becomes chronic rather than acute. Sailors, prisoners in solitary confinement, and lone researchers in Antarctic stations have all described developing these relationships over weeks or months. Stephen Callahan, who survived 76 days adrift in the Atlantic after his sailboat sank, talked about having lengthy conversations with a presence he nicknamed the Voice. This wasn't a comforting guardian angel. It was a critical, demanding companion that pushed him to maintain his survival routines when depression tempted him to simply give up and let the ocean take him. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like this reveal something crucial about human neurology. We are fundamentally social creatures, and our brains will manufacture social connection rather than operate in a vacuum. The limbic system, which processes emotions and social bonding, doesn't shut down just because you're alone. It keeps searching for connection, and if none exists externally, it'll create it internally. Your brain would rather you talk to yourself in the guise of talking to someone else than slide into the psychological abyss that total isolation represents. Now here's where it gets really wild. These companions often develop personalities that are distinctly different from the person experiencing them. They're not just echoes or projections. They take on their own character traits, opinions, and behaviors. Frank Worsley, captain of Shackleton's ship Endurance, reported that his invisible companion was stern and demanding, pushing him harder than he would have pushed himself. Compare that to the Italian mountaineer Reinhold Messner, who described a gentle, almost maternal presence during his solo ascent of Everest without supplemental oxygen. The brain doesn't just copy-paste your personality into a ghost. It creates what you need most at that moment. If you need discipline, you get a taskmaster. If you need comfort, you get a nurturer. If you need validation, you get a cheerleader. This customization reveals the incredible sophistication of human behavior under stress. Your unconscious mind is constantly assessing what psychological resource you're lacking and then manufacturing it through this hallucinatory companion. Neuroscientists like Olaf Blanke at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology have studied this by artificially stimulating the temporoparietal junction in subjects, causing them to sense presences behind them. But the naturally occurring version, the one that emerges from genuine desperation, is far more complex because it's not just a sensory glitch, it's a narrative construction, complete with dialogue and relationship dynamics. The really uncomfortable question is this: if these companions are so helpful, so effective at keeping people alive and sane, why do they eventually disappear? Most survivors report that once they're rescued or the immediate crisis ends, their invisible friend simply fades away, sometimes gradually, sometimes overnight. It's like your brain flips a switch and says, okay, we've got real people now, we can shut down the simulation. But for some, the companion doesn't leave quite so easily, and that's when we start moving into more troubling territory. Bernard Moitessier, the French sailor who famously abandoned the Sunday Times Golden Globe race in 1969, despite being in the lead, later admitted that he'd developed such a close relationship with his onboard presences that returning to human society felt like betrayal. He sailed on for another 3 months, choosing his invisible companions over prize money and fame. That's not just weird psychology, that's the human psyche, revealing its preference for manageable fiction over overwhelming reality. The desperate imaginary companion becomes so integrated into your daily survival that losing it feels like losing a real relationship, and sometimes the grief of that loss is profound. The question that lingers, the one that opens up as this phenomenon continues, is what happens when that presence doesn't feel so benevolent anymore, when the line between helpful hallucination and something darker starts to blur. The thin line between guidance and hostile hallucination. Here's where the story takes a darker turn, and where psychology and human behavior reveal their most unsettling edges. Not every presence that appears in crisis is there to help you. Some show up to torment, criticize, or actively sabotage your survival. The line between a guardian angel and a demon is thinner than most people realize, and it's determined by factors we're only beginning to understand. When Australian climber Lincoln Hall was left for dead near the summit of Everest in 2006, suffering from severe cerebral edema and hypothermia, he reported hallucinations that were far from comforting. He saw rows of people sitting like an audience, watching him die, and felt accused by invisible voices of abandoning his family. This wasn't guidance. This was psychological warfare waged by his own oxygen-starved brain. The shift from benevolent companion to hostile presence seems to correlate with specific neurological states: extreme guilt, moral conflict, or trauma that predates the survival situation. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by what's already lurking in your psychological basement. If you're carrying unresolved shame or self-hatred, your brain might not manufacture a friend. It might create a prosecutor instead, someone who voices all those dark thoughts you've been suppressing. The research on this gets really interesting when you look at cases where the same person experiences both types of presences during a single ordeal. Joe Simpson, the mountaineer whose survival story was documented in Touching the Void, described 2 distinct voices during his crawl out of a crevasse in the Peruvian Andes with a shattered leg. One voice was calm, methodical, offering practical advice about how to move, when to rest, how to conserve energy. But the other voice was vicious, telling him he was pathetic, that he deserved to die, that his climbing partner had abandoned him because he was worthless. Simpson later realized that the hostile voice was an internalization of his own self-criticism, amplified to nightmarish proportions by pain, exhaustion, and terror. This dual manifestation reveals something crucial about human behavior under extreme stress. Your brain doesn't just create what you need, it also externalizes what you fear about yourself. The hostile hallucination is often a projection of the internal critic we all carry, the voice that questions our worth and competence. When your defenses are completely stripped away by physical trauma and mortal danger, that critic gets a megaphone and becomes indistinguishable from an external presence. Weird psychology at its most brutal. What makes hostile presences particularly dangerous is that they can interfere with survival decisions. Unlike the helpful third man who pushes you forward, the hostile presence might tell you to give up, to stop moving, to accept death as deserved punishment. There are documented cases of solo hikers found dead in situations where they could have survived if they'd simply kept walking, but who apparently sat down and stopped fighting. We can't know for certain what they experienced in their final hours, but researchers studying the psychology of paradoxical undressing in hypothermia, victims have found evidence suggesting that some people experience command hallucinations, voices ordering them to remove their clothing or stop seeking shelter. These aren't random neurological misfires. They're the brain's stress response gone catastrophically wrong, turning the survival mechanism into a death sentence. The temporoparietal junction, which creates the sense of presence, sits right next to regions involved in self-referential thinking and moral judgment. When that whole network gets scrambled by oxygen deprivation, hypoglycemia, or extreme stress hormones like cortisol, the wires can cross in ways that transform your inner dialogue into an external tormentor. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena stop being fascinating intellectual curiosities when they actively work against survival. The really terrifying aspect is how real these hostile presences feel. There's no subjective difference between a helpful guide and a malevolent persecutor in terms of perceived authenticity. Both feel utterly, undeniably present. Charles Lindbergh, during his solo transatlantic flight in 1927, reported benevolent presences in the cockpit helping him navigate, but other solo pilots have described voices commanding them to dive into the ocean or fly into mountains. The difference might come down to neurochemistry in that specific moment. Dopamine and oxytocin tend to create positive bonding experiences, while excess glutamate and disrupted GABA can produce paranoid, threatening perceptions. Your brain's chemical state literally determines whether your manufactured companion wants to save you or destroy you. And here's the kicker: you can't always tell which one you're dealing with until you follow the advice. Some survivors report initially trusting a presence that led them in circles or told them to abandon their supplies, realizing only later that they were being deceived by their own compromised neurology. The question that emerges from this darkness, the one that pushes into even stranger territory, is whether these presences are entirely internal creations, or if there's something else at play, some neurological architecture we haven't fully mapped yet, that blurs the boundary between imagination and perception in ways that challenge our understanding of consciousness itself. Architects of the invisible mind. So who's building these invisible companions, and how does the construction actually happen? The answer takes us deep into the neuroscience of consciousness, where psychology and human behavior intersect with brain architecture in ways that challenge everything we think we know about reality. The primary suspect is the temporoparietal junction, a region where your parietal lobe, which handles spatial awareness and body position, meets your temporal lobe, which processes sensory input and memory. When this area gets disrupted by stress, oxygen deprivation, or extreme fatigue, it can create what neuroscientists call sensed presence experiences. But that's just the trigger, not the whole story. The actual construction of the companion involves multiple brain regions working together, or more accurately, failing to work together properly. Your brain is constantly building a model of reality based on sensory input. And when that input gets degraded or contradictory, the model starts filling in gaps with fabricated information. It's like your mind saying, I'm not getting clear data about who's around me, but I'm getting signals that suggest someone's there, so I'll just assume there is, and build a person from scratch. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena emerge from this gap-filling process, revealing that what we call reality is actually a carefully constructed simulation that usually matches external facts but can deviate dramatically under the right circumstances. The process isn't random. Your brain pulls from memory, cultural programming, and emotional needs to construct the companion. That's why Shackleton's presence felt like a fellow explorer, why religious individuals often interpret their third man as an angel or deity, and why some people experience companions that resemble deceased loved ones. The medial prefrontal cortex, which handles self-referential thinking and theory of mind, understanding what others might be thinking, stays partially active even when other executive functions shut down. This region starts projecting intentions and personality onto the sensed presence, essentially asking, if someone were here, what would they be like? What would they say? Your unconscious mind then answers those questions using whatever material it has available. Neuroscientist Michael Persinger conducted controversial experiments in the 1980s and 90s using transcranial magnetic stimulation to artificially trigger sensed presence experiences in laboratory settings. He found that stimulating the temporal lobes created everything from vague feelings of being watched to fully formed visions of God. His work, while debated, suggested that the architecture for these experiences is built into normal brain function. It just needs the right trigger to activate. Weird psychology isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature that usually stays dormant but becomes crucial when circumstances demand it. Here's where it gets fascinating. The brain doesn't just create one type of presence, it has different templates depending on what you need. Researchers studying human behavior in isolation have identified patterns in how these companions manifest. If you're facing a navigation challenge, your brain tends to create a guide figure, someone who seems to know the way. If you're dealing with physical pain or exhaustion, you might get a coach or drill sergeant pushing you forward. If you're processing trauma or moral conflict, you could manifest a judge or confessor. The anterior cingulate cortex, which handles error detection and conflict monitoring, seems to play a role in determining the companion's emotional tone. When this region detects that you're making survival-threatening mistakes, moving too slowly, giving up hope, making poor decisions, it can trigger the creation of a presence that provides course correction. But if the anterior cingulate itself is compromised by extreme stress, it might create a hostile presence that amplifies rather than resolves the conflict. The architecture is incredibly sophisticated. Your brain has essentially evolved a modular system for manufacturing social support when none exists externally. Think about the evolutionary advantage. A human who can generate internal companionship during isolation is more likely to maintain motivation, continue problem-solving, and ultimately survive than someone who psychologically collapses when alone. The role of neurotransmitters in this construction process can't be overstated. Dopamine, which regulates reward, and motivation, helps create the positive reinforcement loop that makes following the companion's advice feel rewarding. Serotonin, which modulates mood and social behavior, influences whether the presence feels trustworthy or threatening. Norepinephrine, released during stress, can amplify the vividness and emotional intensity of the experience. And then there's the endogenous opioid system, your brain's natural painkillers, which can create feelings of transcendence and spiritual connection when you're in extreme distress. That's why so many third-man experiences have a mystical quality. You're essentially getting a neurochemical cocktail that mirrors what people experience during meditation, prayer, or psychedelic states. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena often share common neurological pathways, regardless of how they're triggered. The architects of the invisible mind aren't mysterious external entities. They're specialized neural circuits that have been shaped by millions of years of human evolution to keep us alive when isolation threatens to kill us. But as sophisticated as this system is, it's not perfect, and sometimes the construction crew doesn't know when to stop building, doesn't know when the emergency is over, and that's when we move into the really problematic territory, when the companion doesn't leave. The most disturbing aspect of the third man effect isn't when it appears, it's when it refuses to disappear. Most survivors report that their invisible companion fades away once they're rescued, once the crisis ends, once their brain chemistry normalizes and they're surrounded by real people again. But for a small percentage, the presence lingers, showing up in moments of stress, solitude, or even during normal daily life. This is where psychology and human behavior cross into territory that makes even seasoned researchers uncomfortable, because now we're not talking about an adaptive survival mechanism. We're talking about persistent alteration of consciousness that can't be easily explained or dismissed. Some mountaineers report feeling their third man return years after their near-death experience, particularly when they're back at high altitude or facing dangerous conditions. It's like the brain has created a template, a psychological shortcut, and once that neural pathway is established, it becomes easier to activate again. The phenomenon stops being an emergency response and starts becoming a permanent feature of how that person's mind processes isolation and threat. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena have a tendency to rewire the brain when they're intense enough, creating lasting changes in neural architecture that persist long after the triggering event. What happens when the companion becomes unwelcome? This is the dark side that most popular accounts of the third man effect conveniently ignore. There are documented cases of people who continued experiencing presences after returning to normal life, but these weren't the comforting guides from their survival story. These were intrusive, sometimes hostile entities that showed up uninvited. One Antarctic researcher, whose name was kept confidential in psychiatric literature, reported that the presence he'd developed during a winter-over stay at a remote station followed him home and began appearing in his bedroom at night. What had been helpful in Antarctica became terrifying in suburban Australia. He eventually required treatment for what clinicians diagnosed as stress-induced psychosis, but he maintained that it wasn't a psychotic break. It was the same presence, just displaced from its original context. This raises uncomfortable questions about the line between adaptive hallucination and pathological condition. When does weird psychology stop being a fascinating survival mechanism and start being a mental health crisis? The diagnostic criteria for psychosis include hallucinations that persist in non-threatening environments, that cause distress, and that the person can't dismiss as unreal. But what about someone who knows their third man isn't physically real, but still experiences it as present? That's a gray zone where neuroscience, psychiatry, and philosophy all collide without clear answers. The persistence of these companions might be explained by kindling effects in the brain, the idea that neural pathways become more easily activated with repeated use. If your temporoparietal junction created a presence once under extreme conditions, that circuit is now established, and future stress might reactivate it at a lower threshold. Think of it like a mental muscle memory. Your brain learned how to do something, and now it can do it more easily. Some survivors report being able to voluntarily summon their companion during difficult times, feeling lonely, needing motivation, facing a challenging decision. They've essentially trained their brain to provide this service on demand. But there's a risk here that parallels addiction. The more you rely on an internal coping mechanism, the less you develop external support systems and real-world problem-solving skills. Human behavior adapted to include these invisible companions might become maladaptive when the person can't distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate contexts for the experience. A mountaineer who feels their guide presence on every climb might be fine, but someone who needs that presence to get through a normal workday might be developing a dependency that masks underlying psychological issues like anxiety, depression, or unresolved trauma. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena can become crutches when they're supposed to be emergency measures. The question nobody wants to ask, but needs to be addressed is this: what if the companion never really leaves because it was never entirely internal to begin with? Before you dismiss this as supernatural nonsense, consider what cutting-edge consciousness research is revealing about the boundaries of the self. The default mode network, which activates when you're not focused on external tasks, constantly generates a sense of you as a continuous entity, separate from the environment. But that boundary isn't as solid as it feels. It's a construct maintained by constant neural activity. When that activity gets disrupted by extreme stress, the boundary can become permeable in strange ways. Some researchers, including Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine, argue that consciousness might not be generated by the brain, but filtered through it, a controversial idea that would suggest hallucinated presences might be accessing something outside individual neurology. Most mainstream neuroscientists reject this, insisting the third man is entirely explicable through known brain mechanisms. But the fact remains that some people never fully shake their companion, and they describe it not as a memory or recurring hallucination, but as an ongoing relationship with something that exists independently of their conscious control. Whether that's true externality or just a very convincing simulation created by unconscious processes, the effect on the person's psychology and human behavior is identical. They live with a presence, and that presence shapes their decisions, their emotional life, and their understanding of what's real. And perhaps that's the deepest truth about the third man effect. It forces us to confront how fragile the boundary between self and other really is, and how easily the mind can rewrite the rules of what counts as real when survival demands it. So what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to file it away as just another interesting fact about weird psychology? Or are you going to let it fundamentally shift how you understand your own mind? Because here's the reality. You don't have to be dying on a mountain or lost at sea to experience a version of the third man effect. Every time you push through exhaustion at the gym and hear that voice telling you one more rep, every time you're driving home late at night and feel like someone's watching over you, every time you have an internal dialogue that feels like talking to someone else, you're tapping into the same neural machinery. The difference is just a matter of degree. Your brain is already practicing these skills in low-stakes situations, building the circuits that could save your life in a genuine crisis. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena aren't separate from normal experience. They're extreme versions of processes happening in your head right now. The question is whether you're going to stay ignorant of how your own consciousness works, or whether you're going to start paying attention to the architecture of your inner world. What voices do you already listen to? Which ones are helping you survive and which ones are holding you back? Because if your brain can manufacture a companion to guide you through a blizzard, it can also manufacture critics, doubters, and saboteurs when you're not paying attention. Psychology and human behavior don't come with an off switch. You're always running these programs whether you're conscious of them or not. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When was the last time you were truly, completely alone? Not just physically alone, but mentally alone. No phone, no music, no distractions, just you and your thoughts. Most people can't handle more than a few minutes of that before reaching for stimulation because isolation triggers anxiety in ways we've been conditioned to avoid. But what if that avoidance is making you weaker, not stronger? What if the ability to be alone with yourself, to sit with discomfort without manufacturing distractions, is actually training the same resilience that creates helpful third-man experiences instead of hostile ones? The survivors who report benevolent presences tend to be people who've spent time in solitude before crisis hit. Mountaineers who train alone, sailors who choose solo voyages, researchers who volunteer for isolated stations. They've taught their brains that being alone doesn't equal being in danger. Compare that to someone who's never developed that tolerance, whose brain has only learned to associate isolation with threat. When crisis hits them, their third man might be panic incarnate rather than a calm guide. You want to know how to prepare for the worst moment of your life? Start by learning to be comfortable in your own head. Start by recognizing which internal voices serve you and which ones are just echoes of fear and conditioning. Human behavior under extreme stress is just an amplified version of human behavior under normal stress. So, what are you practicing? Right now, here's what I want you to do. Pay attention to the conversations you're already having with yourself. Notice when you talk yourself through challenges, when you imagine what someone else would say, when you feel guided by intuition that seems to come from outside yourself. That's your brain's social simulation software running in the background, and it's revealing the templates you've built for companionship, guidance, and support. Are those templates helpful or harmful? Are they pushing you toward growth or keeping you trapped in patterns that no longer serve you? Strange and unusual psychological phenomena give us a window into the mechanics of consciousness that we usually take for granted. The third man effect isn't just about survival in extreme situations. It's about understanding that your sense of self, your perception of reality, your experience of being you is far more fluid and constructed than it feels. And if that's true, then you have way more control over your internal experience than you've been led to believe. You can deliberately cultivate the kind of inner voice that will serve you when everything falls apart. You can practice the mental resilience that turns crisis into challenge rather than collapse. Or you can ignore all this, go back to autopilot, and hope you never face a situation extreme enough to reveal what your unconscious mind has been building while you weren't paying attention. Which version of yourself do you want to discover when the stakes are highest? Don't just consume this information and move on. Question everything you think you know about consciousness. Research the neuroscience of the temporoparietal junction. Read the survival accounts we've discussed, Shackleton's South, Joe Simpson's Touching the Void, Stephen Callahan's Adrift. Pay attention to your own mental architecture the next time you're stressed, exhausted, or isolated. This isn't abstract knowledge. This is practical psychology and human behavior that could literally save your life or help you understand someone else's experience when they're struggling. And look, I know most people won't do anything with this. They'll watch, think, that's interesting, and forget about it by tomorrow. But you're not most people, are you? You're someone who's willing to sit with uncomfortable truths about how fragile and powerful the human mind really is. So here's my challenge. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started exploring weird psychology that actually matters. We're going deeper into consciousness, neuroscience, and the strange phenomena that reveal what we really are beneath the surface. The third man effect is just one doorway into understanding how your brain constructs reality. And once you start seeing those construction seams, you can't unsee them. Are you ready to keep going down this rabbit hole? Or are you going to back away from knowledge that might change everything? The choice is yours, but I already know which one leads to growth.